The world remembers General George S. Patton as the man who never seemed afraid. A commander who pushed armies forward when others hesitated. A leader whose confidence was so overwhelming that even his own soldiers believed he was destined for greatness. But what if that image wasn't the full story? What if, at one of the most defining moments of his early career, Patton privately believed he might fail? And what if the most honest words he ever wrote were never meant for history at all? Because long before the medals, before the victories, before his name became legend, there was a letter. A private letter written not for the army, not for the public, but for his wife. Inside that letter wasn't just strategy or ambition. It was something far more human. Doubt, pressure, and a man standing on the edge of uncertainty. So what did George Patton really write in that moment? And why does it reveal a side of him history rarely talks about? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning, before the world ever called him a legend. At this stage of his life, George S. Patton was not the name history would later carve into textbooks. He was still an ambitious officer inside a military system that did not reward emotion, personality, or personal belief in greatness. It rewarded results. And Patton was still chasing his. Every assignment he received felt heavier than it should have. Not because the tasks were impossible, but because he treated each one as if it defined his entire future. A failed evaluation didn't feel like a setback. It felt like a warning. A delayed promotion didn't feel like bureaucracy. It felt like judgment. Because Patton was not just trying to build a career. He was trying to prove something far more fragile. That the vision he had of himself was real. But the deeper he went into military life, the more dangerous that belief became. Because when a man ties his identity to destiny, even small obstacles start to feel like signs that destiny might not exist at all. And Patton began to notice something he could not ignore. Progress was slow, recognition was uncertain, and the future he had imagined so clearly in his mind was not guaranteed in reality. That gap between expectation and reality created a pressure most people around him never saw. To the outside world, he appeared disciplined, focused, controlled, but internally, something was building. A quiet tension that never fully left him. The kind of tension that does not explode outward. It builds inward, into thoughts that repeat, into doubts that linger, into questions he did not speak aloud. What if he was wrong about himself? What if all the effort still led nowhere? And in one of those rare moments of isolation, where the weight of those questions became too heavy to ignore, Patton did something he almost never allowed himself to do. He stopped performing, and he wrote a letter to his wife, not as a soldier, not as an officer, but as a man trying to make sense of what he might become. The letter did not come from a moment of victory. It came from pressure, from silence, from the kind of mental weight that builds when a man feels he is running out of time to become who he believes he should be. At this point, Patton's life was still unfolding in uncertainty. There was no guarantee of command that would define him. No war on the scale that would later elevate his name. Only a steady climb through a system where progress was slow and competition was constant. And that uncertainty became the real battlefield. Because Patton did not fear work. He feared irrelevance. The possibility that years of discipline, training, and ambition might lead to nothing meaningful at all. To most people around him, he still looked in control. He spoke with authority. He carried himself with intensity. He made decisions without hesitation. But control in public does not erase doubt in private, and that is where the real conflict began. In quiet moments, away from ranks and expectations, Patton's mind kept returning to the same unresolved thought. If opportunity never came, would his life still matter the way he believed it should? That question followed him longer than any mission order or military instruction. And it is what pushed him deeper into himself. Because the truth was simple but uncomfortable. He was not only fighting for promotion, he was fighting for confirmation. Confirmation that the identity he had built in his mind was not an illusion. That he was not chasing a version of himself that would never exist in reality. And in that emotional tension, the distance between Patton the officer and Patton the man became impossible to ignore. It was in this state, between ambition and uncertainty, that he finally wrote again to his wife. Not to report, not to impress, but to reveal what he could not say openly anywhere else. And what he wrote next carried a weight even he may not have fully understood at the time. This was the letter where Patton stopped filtering himself. Not completely in the sense of revealing everything, but enough to show something most men in his position would never admit, even in private. He wrote as someone caught between two versions of himself: the man the army expected him to become, and the man he feared he might never fully reach. There was no battlefield in that moment, no enemy visible in front of him, only the slow, internal pressure of expectation building over time. In his words, there was a quiet honesty that did not match the image he carried in uniform. He acknowledged the strain of constantly pushing forward without knowing whether the destination he believed in would ever truly arrive. He did not speak in the language of defeat, but he did speak in the language of uncertainty. And for George Patton, that was rare, because uncertainty was not something he displayed publicly. It was something he fought internally, often without letting anyone see the struggle. In the letter, he allowed that struggle to surface. He admitted, carefully, indirectly, that success was not guaranteed, even for someone who worked as relentlessly as he did. And more importantly, he revealed something deeper beneath the surface of ambition: the fear that he might spend his entire life chasing greatness without ever fully reaching it. But what makes this moment significant is not just what he felt. It is what he chose to do with that feeling. He did not retreat. He did not slow down. He did not allow doubt to become a conclusion. Instead, he used the letter as a way to steady himself, a private recalibration between fear and action. And in doing so, he exposed the real conflict that would define him long before history ever did. Not the war against enemies, but the war against hesitation. And that internal struggle would only intensify as his career moved closer to the moment where doubt could no longer remain private. As time passed, the uncertainty Patton once carried in private began to collide with reality. The military world around him was changing, and with it came new expectations, new pressures, and a higher demand for leaders who could perform under conditions far beyond training exercises or theoretical planning. Patton was stepping closer to the kind of responsibility he had always believed he was meant for. But with that responsibility came exposure. No longer was his ability measured in quiet evaluations or distant opinions. Now it would be tested in real situations where outcomes could not be hidden behind reports or assumptions. And that shift changed everything. Because once a man reaches a position where decisions carry visible consequences, doubt becomes harder to control. Reports from his superiors and observations from fellow officers began forming a more complicated picture of him. Some saw brilliance in his intensity, a kind of aggressive clarity that could push operations forward when others hesitated. Others saw risk, a tendency to move too fast, to demand too much, to rely on momentum that might not always be sustainable. These contradictions created tension around him, not just about his methods, but about what kind of leader he truly was. And Patton, aware of this growing scrutiny, found himself in a position he had long feared. He was no longer being evaluated for potential. He was being evaluated for proof. Every decision carried weight. Every success raised expectations. Every mistake sharpened criticism. And behind all of it, the same private question he had once written in his letter quietly returned. What if the fear he once admitted was not just a feeling but a warning? Because now, failure was no longer an abstract idea. It was a real possibility with real consequences. And as pressure increased, so did the need for absolute clarity. Patton could no longer exist in the space between uncertainty and action. Soon, he would have to choose what kind of leader he truly was under conditions where hesitation was not an option. And that moment of decision was approaching faster than anyone realized. The moment Patton had been moving toward his entire life did not arrive quietly. It arrived under pressure. As global conflict expanded into World War II, Patton finally stepped into the level of command he had long believed he was destined for. Large-scale operations, real armies, real consequences, no room for theory, hesitation, or private uncertainty. This was the stage he had imagined for years, but it did not remove the fear he once wrote about in his private letter. It exposed it in a different form. Because now, doubt was no longer something he could hide in silence. It had to be managed in motion, through decisions, timing, and leadership under extreme conditions. And in that environment, Patton changed in a way few people understood. Not into someone without fear, but into someone who could no longer afford to stop because of it. His leadership style became sharper, faster, more decisive, He pushed operations forward with urgency, often demanding more than those around him thought possible. Some saw it as brilliance under pressure. Others saw it as risk under strain. But underneath both interpretations was the same truth. Patton was still the man who once feared failure. Only now, he had learned to move through that fear instead of waiting for it to disappear. And that is where the meaning of his private letter becomes clear. It was not a confession of weakness. It was a record of internal reality. A moment in time where a future general admitted what every leader eventually learns in one form or another. That confidence is not the absence of doubt. It is the decision to act despite it. By the time history remembers him as a great commander, Patton was no longer the uncertain officer writing private fears to his wife. He had become someone shaped by those fears, but not defined by them. And the question that once haunted him in silence had already been answered, not in words, but in action. Did he fail? History says no, but the deeper truth is more human. He succeeded while still carrying the fear of failure with him. And that is what made him a leader. Not certainty, but persistence under pressure. If stories like this resonate with you, real moments where leadership is tested under pressure, and where powerful figures reveal their hidden human side, then subscribe. Because this channel isn't just about history. It's about the decisions behind history, the moments no one sees, the doubts no one admits, and the pressure that shapes leaders long before the world recognizes their name. New stories are coming that uncover exactly that, how authority is challenged, how injustice is confronted, and how character is revealed when everything is on the line. So if you want more real stories like this, stay with us. Because sometimes, the most important battles are not fought in public. They're fought in silence,